Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and around the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I am, of course, Brianna Griffith, and this week we are continuing our Great Power Conflict monthly segment where we talk about sort of the latest geopolitical news with regard to I guess you could consider it like the escalating tensions between U.S. and China. In fact, the what would better be described perhaps as the U.S. aggression toward China that's ramped up, especially over the last decade. So there have been a lot of interesting developments for sure since we last covered this. I'd like to, of course, get through some of the kind of Western and capitalist media mythology and sort of look at another perspective on essentially what it is that's going on with China, what it is that we're hearing in the news, as opposed to again, the kind of other perspectives and sort of the reality within that. So to talk about all this for the next hour, for the next half hour, we're going to be joined by Ken Hammond, who's a professor of history at New Mexico State University. Thank you so much, Dr. Hammond, for returning to the show once again.
Good, great to be back. Glad to be here.
I'm so glad to speak with you. So I would love to get into kind of the big story that's been dominating U.S. media. That is the quote unquote disappearance or the laying low of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, who, according to U.S. media, has not been seen publicly in months. I mean, that's entirely likely that he is not, after kind of running afoul and criticizing Chinese certain economic regulations. Can we get into what really is the heart of the story here?
Sure. Yeah. The situation with Jack Ma, or Ma Yun is his Chinese name, is that yes, he has not made a public appearance since the last day of October 31st, which was in the wake of a speech he had given, in which he made some very strong critical comments about the regulatory system in China, in particular, Chinese efforts to regulate and sort of guide the operations of really big corporations. Jack Ma, of course, founder of Alibaba, and Alibaba in China stands in the same kind of role that we think of companies like Facebook or Google or Amazon here in the U.S., involved in all different kinds of activities, having a very major place, not just in wealth production, but in the control of information, in marketing, all this kind of stuff. So it's a very, very big thing. And Jack Ma has had a very interesting career, and as one of China's most famous, certainly, and leading contemporary capitalists, I suppose we could say, he's a very, very public figure. He's been, over the years, he's been very careful. He's been very good in many ways about having, about sort of, as they like to say, paying it back, contributing to a lot of public goods, contributing to a lot of social causes, things like that. But in this most recent incident, he really was being very critical and kind of pushing hard against the policies of the government and the leadership of the party. And as a result of that, there's been some steps taken, some measures taken, particularly some critical oversight of an IPO, initial public offering, for what's called the Ant Group, which is a private venture that he has been involved in building, that was ready to go public and issue a stock offering that would have raised a lot of money. A lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars probably. And that has now been delayed. And the reason for that is that regulatory oversight has raised some issues and questions, and so that's been deferred. So now Jack Ma has been, as we say, out of public sight for 2.5 months. But it's not as though he's sort of disappeared into some mysterious zone. He's at home, one of his homes, and he's in communication with people. It isn't that he's not, that he's somehow been sequestered somewhere. I was just reading earlier today a discussion by one of his associates that says he's doing fine. He's keeping a low profile. And I think that's we don't want to give into or buy into too much of the mainstream media kind of headlines about this kind of stuff. But I think the nut of what's going on, the real issue here, is that China today, using markets as it is to develop its economy, has this very careful process of trying to both use the developmental potential of capital markets to build the productive economy, but also to keep that from getting out of control, to make sure that although there may be capitalists like Jack Ma, that there's not a capitalist class, there's not a bourgeoisie which is contending for power, which is trying to take over and change the direction of China's socialist government, socialist development. So I think that basically at this point, the party and the state are sending a bit of a message to Jack and to the capitalists more broadly to say, we're happy to work with you. We're happy to use your abilities, your skills, your talents to build the economy. And we're happy to give you a high degree of autonomy, but don't push it. Don't try to assert yourselves over the interests of society, over the interests of the people, over the developmental trajectory that China is pursuing. So I think that's really the essence of what's going on here.
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating economic development for sure, the way China has taken this path, whether rightly or wrongly. I know that there was sort of, have been kind of many threads of thought within, historically within the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has taken this sort of path of development along certain capitalist lines within very, very tight state control in a way that to me is almost reminiscent, I would say, of kind of the end of feudalism as sort of the capitalist merchants, often kind of bought off the feudalist lords, the monarchies and whatnot. And so you kind of have this overlapping of two sort of systems, the nascent economic system that is clearly on the rise, and sort of these remnants or these continued hangers on really of an old system that may continue to be very wealthy, but don't truly hold political power. I think that's where so much of the confusion around this quote unquote, is China socialist, is China capitalist, comes from, is this not understanding of sort of this, the way, for instance, a Marxist approach to the state works. That's not entirely like we can't, for instance, simply or someone within the realm of statecraft can't, for instance, simply will themselves into entirely a socialist state, but they can take these kind of steps where they don't collapse their economy with the kind of capital flight that ensues whenever you say there's not going to be any more capitalism. So essentially China has for more or less eliminated extreme poverty over the course of several decades. China continues to kind of develop economically, even during this major recession, possibly economic depression, complete economic collapse that we're facing in much of the capitalist world. It seems that China's economy may still be on track to grow, not just to not shrink as much as the capitalist economies, but may even continue to grow during all of this. So I think, again, if we consider economics to be sort of this stable development that provides for the betterment of their people, of the people within the state, I think certainly the economic model in China has paid off so much better than anywhere or almost anywhere else in the go ahead.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I agree with that. And I think that, we've had at least a couple of major demonstrations of that in recent history. Certainly right now, of course, China's ability, first of all, to prioritize public health, to mobilize economic and political and social resources to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic there last spring, so that in a matter of 2 months, 2.5 months, China was able to bring this under control, provide for the welfare of its people, devote the resources that were necessary to be very effective in managing this problem, and of course to contribute to global research, to publicizing the genome of the virus, doing all these things to contribute to global public health as well in a very positive way. And that has allowed them, exactly as you say, to be the only significant economy in the world right now, which is growing. It's not growing at the kind of rate that it was a few years ago, but its recovery is already well underway, and it'll probably resume pretty normal growth next year. So that's one very, very recent example. And of course, 12 years, 13 years or so ago, the great capital meltdown of 2008 and beyond, China also weathered that. They were again able to mobilize resources, and the socialist nature of the Chinese economy, which meant that even workers, the 20 million workers who were laid off because demand for the products from the factories where they worked had evaporated, they were sustained by public ownership. They were sustained. They could go back to their villages. They could have the social services, the educational services, the healthcare services that they needed to sort of weather that storm, so that when the economy began to pick up again, and as China has begun to focus more on domestic consumption and less on its export economy, those people were able to survive, to get back to work, to either resume their old jobs or find new ones. And China came through that, not just the Chinese economy in some abstract sense, but the working class, the working people came through that much more unscathed than populations in the West, where people who lost their jobs, as we know, are simply cast out into the marketplace of labor to fend for themselves. So I think that the socialist nature of the Chinese economy, even with this dynamic capital sector that it has, is persistent, and the leadership of the Communist Party, the guidance that it provides in that process, is vital to maintaining these social mechanisms and safeguards that ensure that even though there's profits being made and there's companies that are operating as capitalist enterprises, that they're not dominating the economy, dominating society, and enriching themselves, basically without constraint at public expense.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic rather originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin. And also is broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever podcasts are podded. We are talking with Professor Ken Hammond, professor of history at New Mexico State University. So yeah, for the first kind of half of this segment, we discussed, the way the Western media has so horrifically reported on Jack Ma's essentially laying low in public life, the fact that he continues to be in communication with people, and yet he's reporting was at one point being reported as having disappeared, etc. Really approaching kind of DPRK or like the way that kind of Western media always reports on North Korea, the fact that, anytime someone in North Korea doesn't show up in public life for a couple weeks, we get these crazy alarming stories in U.S. media that supposedly they were fed to the dogs, or quote unquote. And then they show up alive a couple weeks later. So either we should just stop believing things that the Western media say about Asian countries of which they have no real knowledge, or we should really be investing in Kim Jong-un's necromancy projects, whatever the case is. We kind of discussed that, but I'd also like to get into some of the more kind of big tech issues around China, especially given that we're seeing such a kind of controversial moves by Twitter, Facebook, and other social media companies, regarding kind of like U.S. civics and whatnot. What are some of the major stories that have been on your radar?
Well, I think that there's a remarkable contrast between, the way that big tech is positioned in the American economy and Western economies in general, and the way that it has been developing and handled in China. I think the contrast between the way that big tech is handled in, say, the United States and in China is that, here there's been a lot of sort of public hand wringing in Congress and the media about the power and the influence of organizations like Apple and Google and Amazon and Facebook and all that. But there hasn't actually been any regulatory measures taken. And in fact, now, just these last few days, we have seen quite a remarkable set of developments, which is that however we may feel about it, the president of the United States has now been silenced on some of these big social media platforms. And not just him, but all kinds of voices. People, some of the protesters demonstrated at the Capitol. This invasion, this sort of riot that took place, inspired by Trump. Some of them have been, banned from this, but it's also the case that people on the left, many people on the left, if they express views which are determined by these tech corporations to be outside of what's acceptable, they get silenced too. And it's an interesting idea that corporations get to exercise restraint on speech, which is forbidden to the state, forbidden to the government. But we, American capital seems fine with the idea that these big corporations should be able to do this. In China, on the other hand, there's been concern about the role of big tech, and there's been a lot of regulatory oversight that has been developing. This indeed is part of the issue that's been going on with Jack Ma, but it's not just Jack Ma. It's the tech sector very broadly in China. Now, China, of course, is involved in a very important developmental process of trying to advance its technologies, its productive technologies, its information technologies. And, that is not a frictionless process. But there's a lot of support, a lot of state support for these kinds of enterprises, for research and development, for the implementation of new technologies. But that's not extended without some sense of social responsibility. And so there is regulation, there is oversight, there is constraint and restraint imposed upon these big tech corporations in China. It just seems it's a contrast which of course makes a lot of sense, which is that in America, where it's the capitalist class that really dominates the government, we see the kinds of developments that have been going on here the last few days. Whereas in China, where the state and the party are the leading forces, they're imposing regulation and constraint upon these big tech corporations there. And that, it seems to me that that's really how it should be, that social responsibility and paying attention, playing by the rules, as it were, applies to them just as it should to everyone else in society. But it's a contrast that I think is worth remarking on.
Yeah, I think it's going to be absolutely crucial for people to sort of think beyond whether or not a particular person they see on Twitter or Facebook is banned. Because obviously we take a figure like Trump. I mean, obviously I see Trump as absolutely despicable. He's a racist. He's a sexist. A lot of what he has done has incited or increased right-wing violence in various ways. I think that's in many ways almost kind of beyond doubt for sure.
Absolutely.
But then the question becomes, do we simply cheer on Trump's banning from one of these platforms? Or do we actually look at the systems in place, sort of which allow for this or that banning, which allow for kind of this or that, quote unquote, free speech, and to that regard, the kind of system set up by American big tech is completely undemocratic. Within China, this is understood to be regulated at a state level, which is to say at really a government level. So if you have opinions on how big tech should be regulated, you can participate within that democratic process. Of course, people always say China isn't really democratic, the party isn't really democratic, et cetera, as though either the Republicans or the Democrats are. But the idea there is that these things are understood to be a public utility in some way, a kind of medium by which the public engages in political discourse, where and thus should be kind of regulated and understood to be a public utility by a public enterprise of some sort or another. Whereas within the United States, it's entirely like these are all private corporations, and sort of the range of the range of opinion, or the range of the Overton window really is whether it should be banned by the CEOs of the tech companies themselves, or whether like the US state, this like incredibly anti-democratic dictatorial state that essentially is owned by, the Jeff Bezos of the world, the billionaires, the bourgeoisie, should step in and do the regulating for them. But there's no sense of kind of public accountability because these aren't seen as public enterprises or something that should be brought into the public sphere in any way whatsoever. And I think that, thinking about in those terms, thinking about the fact that I think it was Facebook then went on to ban Press TV, which is an Iranian media outlet, essentially censoring information coming to the U.S. so that the U.S. has what's its own version of the quote unquote great firewall that the U.S. always accuses China of having, that the U.S. is essentially preventing any sort of information from getting into the country that is critical of U.S. imperialism in any way. I mean, it just, obviously goes to show the hypocrisy, but really like, the fact that these decisions can be made entirely arbitrarily based on, again, like sort of the whims of tech corporations, which we know don't have any of our best interests at heart, I think goes to show that really, we need to be thinking about these things in the way that China thinks about these things, at a kind of more broader systemic and public level.
Exactly. I think that what we see in China is that something like these information technologies. Certainly, the corporations that are developing these often are mixed public and private. They're not purely private enterprises. They're state investment, state involvement. A lot of the research and development that goes on is facilitated by the Chinese university system, a public university system. And so, these technology products, if you will, that emerge from that process are not just it's not just a commodity that can be bought by the highest bidder, but these are matters of public trust. These are matters of social responsibility. Whereas here, although the same can be said about these technologies that get developed, certainly there's been a lot of state involvement. Certainly there's been a lot of involvement from the sectors of public and also private here, universities, things like that. But those products then, once they're patented, once they're bought by the corporations, they become their private property, and they're used simply to perpetuate their pursuit of profitability, and that does not in any way equate with or guarantee any kind of public responsibility or public interest. And they get in front of Congress and they testify about how, oh yes, we're very concerned about this, and we pay a lot of attention to this, but they have no transparency, they have no accountability, as it were. Whereas quite the opposite is the case in China. And what we see is effective enforcement and oversight there, as opposed to a lot of public posturing here.
So we have a few minutes left. I'd say maybe 5 to 7 minutes or so. I'd like to switch in our last little bit here to kind of what we can expect out of the new Biden administration. Again, assuming in the next week or so, something radical doesn't happen, which is not always assumption that can be made. But, I think at this point, obviously the current track is for Biden to become president. The Biden administration will be, coming into power on the 20th. Again, like if all things go according to plan. And as we know, the Biden administration is going to fix everything that's wrong with Trump. We have restored normalcy, and I would basically say it's going to be as close to world peace as anything we've ever gotten. But for real though, I'm thinking of the fact that Biden essentially one of his major lines of attack against Trump before the election was that Trump left us quote unquote at the whim of China with regard to COVID, as though somehow it's China's responsibility to hand over all that it manufactures and hand over all of it. I mean, China actually tried to provide a certain level of expertise to the United States. The United States refused with regard to COVID. China tried to help the U.S. and the U.S. refused. So, again, the U.S. isn't at the whim of China. The U.S. did this to itself. But anyway, I wonder what we can expect with regard to foreign policy in the incoming Biden administration, whether it is actually going to outflank Trump from the right in some regards.
Well, that's a really good question and a good way to perhaps think of it. Yeah, sadly, but certainly not surprisingly, the hostility, the aggression, posture of aggression towards China that is so prevalent in bourgeois circles, both in government and in media and things like that these days, is bipartisan. If anything, the irony is in some ways it's one of the most bipartisan questions that's out there. Both Democrats and Republicans have been, gleefully engaging in all kinds of China bashing, slightly different spins sometimes on this, but there's an unfortunate degree of unanimity. So I'm certainly not in any way optimistic about the prospects for a reset or a new perspective emerging from the Biden administration, and the individuals that he has been appointing to significant foreign policy and national security positions certainly are not people from whom we can anticipate a kinder and gentler perspective on China. I think the difference, if there is one, will be that the Biden administration is likely to pursue at least an objective of building a broader coalition, building a sort of anti-China alliance. And we see that in a number of initiatives that are already being talked about and already being sort of the ground is being prepared for them, trying to reach out to other countries in Asia. This idea, of course, the pivot to Asia, the military and security pivot to Asia is something that goes back to the Obama administration when Biden was the vice president. And that's the repositioning of American global force in a way that's designed to contain and restrain China. But we also see that in terms of reaching out to probably to NATO allies, European allies, and in other parts of the world as well, to try to counter China's emergence as a significant participant in global affairs, economic and social and political affairs. So I think that Trump's kind of rogue state, America first approach, the kind of the bull in the China shop approach, that's likely to go away. Although certainly Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has been on a bit of a rampage in the last couple of weeks, lifting the long established protocols about relations with Taiwan, promoting all these military deals with Taiwan, making lots of provocative statements about the South China Sea and other things. Yeah, I think that Pompeo and that crew, they're trying to kind of wield the wrecking ball as much as possible in these final days of the Trump administration to sort of, leave a legacy of anti-China policies, which even if the Trump administration wanted to be changing course, would be very difficult to sort of, find the right way to put those things, to correct those things. But I think instead, actually, what's going to happen is the Trump administration will, in many ways, have the same orientation towards China, the same fear, the same anticipation that China's rise has to be bad for America, which of course it doesn't. What we really need is a foreign policy and a a movement by the American people to find the ways in which we can share in the prosperous future that China's rise is helping to create for the planet. But I don't think we're going to see that kind of orientation from the Biden administration. I don't think they're as likely to move quite so aggressively, quite so unilaterally, certainly. But I don't think that they're going to try to understand China in any more reasonable way. And I don't think that they're likely to pursue policies which are going to be mutually beneficial for the American people and the Chinese people. I think their interests will be more closely aligned with big capital, but not so much with the American working class.
I think that's a great place to go ahead and wrap it up. We were joined for this segment by Ken Hammond, who's a professor of history at New Mexico State University. Thank you very much, Dr. Hammond, for returning to the show. As always, really appreciate the insights on kind of U.S.-China kind of relations and the great power conflict, quote unquote. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to be here, Brianna. I look forward to talking again.
Absolutely. You're listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM, Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM, New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Welcome back to People's Republic. Unfortunately, I did not get to record the second segment, the news discussion segment that I had planned for today. The commentator I was bringing in has unfortunately had a COVID scare within her family. So I wish her the absolute best. I wish her family the absolute best. I hope everyone has a speedy recovery and that it doesn't get any more out of control than it does. And I please, everyone should take absolute extreme caution during these times. COVID is spiking everywhere. So please be careful and please stay safe, all of you. And so for this second segment, I'm going to be playing a segment of the section in the news, rather the in the news segment of the Socialist Program with Brian Becker, which is a new podcast featuring long-time anti-war socialist organizer Brian Becker. So yeah, this is a segment from that particular podcast. You can find that by going to your podcast app of choice, typing in the Socialist Program with Brian Becker for more information. So yeah, without further ado, this is the Socialist Program.
The forces of fascism are rising. Fascists seized control of the Congress on January 6th. The capitalist government, in spite of its immense power, seems paralyzed in the face of the threat. This weekend will be a new test.
We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity.
Welcome to today's episode of In the News, our Tuesday show on the Socialist Program with Brian Becker. It's January 12th, 2021. This is an in-depth look at the biggest stories in the news right now. We look beyond the headlines and expose the distortions in the corporate-owned media. I'm Nicole Roussel, here with Esther Yverim, Walter Smolarek, and our host, Brian Becker. Brian, we're going to talk today about the rising tide of fascism, and like I said in the introduction, there's going to be a new test this weekend.
Yes, Nicole, we are in unprecedented times. It's extremely important for progressive people to understand exactly what's going on. I'm somewhat distressed that some well-meaning people on the left are minimizing what happened on January 6th and what's likely to happen in the coming days and weeks, minimizing it, trying to frame it as simply a struggle between different ruling class factions. That's true. There is a struggle between ruling class factions, but the forces of fascism have been set into motion in this deliberate, planned, choreographed, orchestrated seizure of the Capitol building, which was partly an inside job. The Congress was temporarily dispersed in an effort to stop the certification vote for the transfer of power to a new administration. This is big, and the danger of fascism is real, and we're going to spend all week talking about it. Nicole, as we said in the beginning, this was an orchestrated operation. This was a planned operation. Donald Trump held the Save America or March for Trump rally starting at around noon in front of the White House at the Ellipse, 16 blocks from the Capitol. It's a straight shot down Constitution Avenue to the Capitol. The rally was designed so that it could end around, just before the vote, the certification vote in Congress was to take place. And Trump did it with the idea that his minions would march on the Capitol and try to stop the vote. They did just that. We're going to hear some audio clips where Trump and his allies like Rudy Giuliani are amping up the crowd. The Capitol was virtually unprotected. Now, remember, there are, I think, about 20 police agencies in Washington, D.C. There's the Capitol Police, 2,300 strong force that their only job is to defend the Capitol building. There's the Metropolitan Police Department. There's the Secret Service. There's the National Park Police. There's the FBI. There's police departments associated with different government agencies. There's a lot of police in Washington, D.C., per capita, probably more than any other city in the country. And yet, when they marched with a clear plan to seize the Capitol, and they did seize it, that Capitol was unprotected. It's an inexplicable event unless it's explicable, unless it's explained by the fact that there was an operation at hand. The Capitol Police Chief, Stephen Sund, sort of fell on his sword. He took responsibility. At first, he resigned, but he is also making it quite clear, and we're going to talk about this with Esther and the rest of us, about how the Capitol Police were actually hamstrung. Their efforts to call for reinforcements stopped. This was an operation. We have to recognize it for what it was. Again, I'm sorry that some forces on the left minimize what happened. People should not minimize. The use of fascist, white supremacist mobs have an important place in American history. Remember, too, this is how Reconstruction ended. This is how the era of Jim Crow was enforced. The lynchings of black people and others throughout American history. The mob has played a very, very important role in American politics. And this is precisely what Donald Trump and Giuliani had in mind. Why did they call the rally at noon on a Wednesday in the middle of a work week? Well, it was because the vote was going to happen. Why did the Republican Attorney General's Association send out robocalls in states around the country telling people, come and march on Congress and stop the fraud? Why did Trump and his allies actually tell the masses of their supporters, the 70 million people, 70 million plus Trump supporters, that Election Day wasn't November 3rd, but it was January 6th, and that if they came together and stopped the steal, if they stopped the certification, Trump could win the election? Why did Trump tell them march on the Capitol and I will meet you there? I mean, we have to put it all together. We will put it all together. Let's just start, though, with an audio clip. This is Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, talking to the crowd right before they set sail on the Capitol.
But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So let's have trial by combat.
Yeah, let's have trial by combat. Now he's telling them, get ready. Now, again, they're led by Proud Boys. They're led by fascists. They're armed. They intend to seize the Capitol on social media platforms, right-wing platforms like Parler and Gab. They've been talking all week about seizing, breaching the Capitol. Let's hear a couple more audio clips from Donald Trump. He says we no longer are playing by the same rules. He tells the crowd right before they march, if you catch someone in fraud, you're allowed to play by different rules. Let's listen to what he says.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules.
Yeah, so he's telling them, forget the constitutional order, the rule of law, blah, 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 the things that are normally said. He says, we're going to fight. He says, when you march on the Capitol, and I'll be with you, we're going to fight. We're going to fight like hell. What is he actually telling them? Is this not part of an operation? Let's listen.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
So, yeah, if you want to save America, and that's the name of the march, you have to fight like hell. And again, Esther, when they got to Congress, they fought like hell. Some of the police fought back. Some of the individual police officers fought back. Some of the black police officers, the Capitol Police, were actually very both brave and smart in terms of redirecting the fascist forces away from the Senate chamber at a moment when the Senate chamber wasn't properly defended. Eventually, all the Congress people, senators and House of Representatives members, they were sheltering in place. They were hiding as the rampage, the destruction of big parts of the building took place. We're going to talk about all of that. We're going to reconstruct it. But I want to say a word before we start to do just that. Again, it's the position of this show that this is not and should not be treated as simply a normal faction fight between different ruling class factions, that there is, in fact, the danger of fascism here. Trump is not ideologically a Nazi. He's not ideologically a fascist. But he's using the fascists, and the fascists are using him. And fascism, to succeed, needs a leadership, and historically a charismatic leader. Fascism's rise is an organic feature of capitalism's degeneration. Just let's remember what we can take from history. By the end of 1940, and just a decade after the stock market crash of 1929, that inaugurated the Great Economic Depression, the Great Depression, which was global in character. Fascism and fascist parties dominated not only Germany and Italy, but almost every country in continental Europe. In the period before Hitler became chancellor, which was January 1933, Germany was considered the most progressive country in Europe. People think now, oh, Germany, right wing, prone towards fascism. No, Germany had a huge socialist party. It had a huge communist party, a big, vibrant, robust trade union movement. It had the most advanced women's rights movement for its time. And it was the first pioneering movement in history for what decades later became the global gay rights struggle. Yet Germany succumbed to Nazism, and all of those movements were destroyed. Fascism must be actively fought by a united front of those forces in society who will be destroyed if it is victorious. The origins of fascism are, in fact, the capitalist system, and the final dissolution of fascism ultimately lies in the victory of socialism. Yes, but in the meantime, there must be a united front against the fascist threat. And Esther, as you help us reconstruct events, I just want to say what I said before. The racist mob, the fascist mob, the white supremacist mob, which, by the way, the German Nazis used the American racial system, the apartheid system, as a premise for the development of their own master race theories and philosophies. The germ of American fascism lies precisely in this kind of activity. What we saw on January 6th is not something new in America. It's something reminiscent of something that existed for a long time. In fact, since the origin of what became the United States of America.
Right, Brian. So I'm sticking with this being just the latest step in a rolling coup attempt that the Trump administration, or that Trump has been foreshadowing for months, as he pronounced the November presidential election flawed before it even occurred. And so we all remember that he worked to cripple the post office for early voting, while at the same time denouncing mail-in ballots in the middle of a pandemic crisis that he extended by his own actions. And then after the election, 2 rallies were held here in D.C. by MAGA, his supporters, and these far-right groups like Stop the Steal and the Proud Boys. And these events turned violent at night with right-wing extremists roaming D.C., assaulting and stabbing people and burning and destroying Black Lives Matter signs wherever they could see them. And that's including at historic Black churches. So on December 31st, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser requested that the D.C. National Guard be ready to assist MPD with traffic control and at metro stations in the district. And because of the media coverage on January 6th, that she requested their assistance on January 6th. But because of media coverage, lots of people don't know that DC's Metropolitan Police Department is not responsible for the U.S. Capitol or federal property. And so the district was not told that they were needed at the Capitol until after the rioters arrived there. So if we want to think about January 6th, I think we have to remember the things we talked about last week. Trump's actions 4 days before the push at the Capitol. Trump called Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and asked him to find 11,000 votes to overturn the election in that state in his favor. And then he threatened Raffensperger about what could happen to him if he did not overturn the election, that Trump repeatedly and then falsely claimed that he had won. And that phone performance was followed up Monday, January 4th, with a speech by Trump as he campaigned in Georgia for Republican Senate candidates Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. And before that crowd, Trump said there's no way that they, meaning the Democrats, are taking over the White House. And so also over the weekend, Stephen Son, the former head of the Capitol Hill Police, recently resigned, asked House and Senate security officers for permission to request that the D.C. National Guard be placed on standby, and he was turned down. Both the House and Senate have a sergeant at arms, and the House sergeant at arms, Paul Irving, said he wasn't comfortable with the optics of formally declaring an emergency ahead of the protest. The Senate sergeant of arms, Michael Stenger, suggested that Son should just informally seek out his guard contacts, asking them to, quote unquote, lean forward and be on alert when Son called them. So Son called the General Major Williams Walker, head of the 1,000 member DC National Guard, to tell him that he might call on him for help. If we can get you leaning forward, Son said, how long do you think that it would take us to get assistance? And Walker said he thought that he could send 125 personnel fairly quickly. And so this is all from the first in-depth interview I saw with Stephen Son in the Washington Post this weekend. And then in the interview, Son also confirms that he conferred with DC Police Chief Robert Conti, who also offered to lend a hand if trouble arose. So by the time we get to Wednesday, it's clear that Trump's Monday speech in Georgia was just a precursor to one that he would give on January 6th. After it was clear that the Democratic senatorial candidates, Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, were all but assured victory in Georgia. And as you mentioned earlier, at the ellipse near the White House, speaker after speaker, including Don Jr. and Rudy Giuliani, whipped up the crowd. And Giuliani in particular, as you mentioned, went all Game of Thrones and exhorted the crowd to hold a trial by combat. And then Trump also stayed in with the theme of battle in his comments. And then he urged the crowd to march to the Capitol. And then all the events ensued that we saw unfold on TV that day.
Yeah.
Esther, we've got a clip of Donald Trump at that rally exhorting people to march with him to the Capitol. I'm going to play that so people can hear.
And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
You know what, Nicole? Trump Trump said, Trump had also denounced Mike Pence. And when the crowd got to the Capitol, when they broke through the police lines, the poorly defended police lines, they were hunting for Pence. They wanted to kill Pence. If they had found Pence or Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi in the seat of government, they would have killed them. I mean, we have an audio clip from them explaining exactly what their plan was. Hang Mike Pence. A remarkable event. And I want to ask all of you, I mean, this was an inside job. You had, after the Capitol was breached, Stephen Sund, who is the commander of the Capitol Police, calls the Department of Defense and talks also to the Secretary of the Army. This is like just minutes after his officers have been overrun. Police officers are being beaten. One of them's beaten to death. He calls the Department of Defense. He said, "We need reinforcements. I urgently request reinforcements. The situation is dire." And it takes the Department of Defense 3 hours. 3 hours. It wasn't until 5:45 that approval is granted so that troops could start to arrive at the Capitol after the whole thing is basically over. So they then are on a rampage. The fascist forces are on a rampage. They're hunting to kill Mike Pence. Again, you can't explain how the Department of Defense did not respond. This is, in fact, the seat of government. But guess what? As Esther mentioned, Paul Irving, who was the sergeant at arms of the House and who resigned, he has disappeared. He not only did he resign, but when the police or media went to interview him at the Watergate Hotel where he was living, neighbors said he moved out. They checked his property in Nevada. He moved out. I mean, what's with the sergeant of arms of the House of Representatives fleeing under these circumstances? I mean, it's so clear that this was a highly organized event. The thing that went wrong for the fascist mob is that Trump said, "We're going to show up. I'm going to be there with you." They thought Trump was going to come in while they were seizing the halls of Congress, and that they were going to anoint Trump to be the leader, that they were going to stop the vote. That's what they expected. But Trump was instead watching it on TV. He was liking what he was seeing as this terrorist attack on the seat of government took place. He started calling members of the U.S. Congress, including members of the U.S. Senate, telling them, how do we find a way to stop the vote? While they're cowering, while they're sheltering in place, Trump is calling them. And then when the thing devolves into chaos and bedlam, Trump got cold feet. He didn't show up as the fascist mob thought he was going to. Instead, he released a videotape where he said, "I love you. I love you." This was around 4 o'clock on TV. "I love you, but you have to go home now." Trump got cold feet. But up until that moment, everything was going according to plan.
Yes, Brian. And so the same chronology where Sund is able to kind of give his narrative about what happened that day really paints a very disturbing picture about a meeting that was held among several officials, Capitol Police, DC Police, Pentagon officials, where the Pentagon officials are continuing to delay and not provide assistance urgently, as if it's not an emergency. So he says that at 12:40 p.m., the first wave of protesters arrived at the Capitol. Sund called Conti, he is the chief of the DC police, who sent 100.
That was a segment from the Socialist Program with Brian Becker. As mentioned, you're, of course, listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. I did not get a chance to record my second interview this week because, unfortunately, the commentator I was planning on bringing in had a COVID scare within the family. I'm wishing her and her family, I'm wishing her family the best recovery. I'm hoping that she does not come down with COVID and that everyone stays safe. And of course, I advise all of you to please stay safe. Please take all necessary precautions. It's real. It's dangerous. So I hope everybody's doing well. I will return next week. Hope you enjoyed this segment from the Socialist Program with Brian Becker. That was the In the News segment, Fighting Fascism. That was released on January 12th. And we'll be back next week with more People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. Hope you enjoyed.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Thanks for tuning in as we report from the front lines of the struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.